I don't see what's wrong with going to the fighting pits, Soraka said. We'd have gotten around to it eventually anyway. Plus, you like fighting, don't you? Even when Mitra was angry, she was beautiful. Probably more so. You idiot warmonger, the Sharon replied. We're in a city. Cities have other things. Fine dining. Cultural pursuits. Shopping. Who comes to a city for a fight unless they're laying siege to it? The people who go to the fighting pits. Wrong answer. They walked in silence, following the river east to the confluence that the innkeeper had mentioned. Due to the primitive state of Rolengork's infrastructure, they were less walking in streets and avenues and more traversing an urban jungle landscape with trails that crisscrossed every which way between the trees. Winding creeks and bubbling brooks made a web of water through the districts, and the residents simply leapt across them rather than build any bridges. That must be the thing. Jaraka pointed a claw to the southwest. That's a huge tree. Well, the remains of one. Soraka looked over his shoulder to his three wives. See? We got to see something interesting after all. Colossal trees were relatively rare outside of Arborea, as they nearly always ended up being central to forest cultures. Races tended to settle around them, and those settlements evolved into cities over the generations. Then, when calamities came, the cities and their colossal trees would be destroyed. The 100-meter-wide stump looming before them was likely the work of the demon gods that the locals referred to. How strong would that make these demon gods? It took a lot to take down a tree so large. Roti-class individuals were nowhere near enough. The demon gods would have to have been at least upper Atarati-class entities, especially if one considered that whatever stood where Rolengork was should have had at least a few powerful defenders of its own. Rana Saja's helpless confusion over trying to explain where the demon gods came from became more understandable with the remains of the colossal tree towering before him. A Roti-class entity was already comparatively rare, an individual who was one in millions. Claiming that multiple Atarati-class entities, an individual who was 1 in 20 to 40 million, had suddenly appeared would have one dismissed as delusional, yet evidence of the ruin that they had wrought was detected everywhere by the members of Soraka's entourage. The locals had no idea what they were sitting on, but it was as plain as day to those with eyes to see. Then joined the flow of citizens walking up one of the roots of the tree. Their path took them to a tunnel bored into the trunk, which led to the hollowed-out bowl of the interior. Kasturi's low growl drew the attention of several passers-by. I can't believe this, she seethed under her breath. A majestic colossus turned into a fighting pit. They're probably not the ones that knocked down this tree, Soraka told her, then turned to the others. Should we split up and take a look around? Several important things were represented in the fighting pit. First, was the tree. There might be evidence of whatever originally stood in Rolengork and what had destroyed it just waiting to be noticed. Second were the citizens who came to spectate. Centers of power usually considered themselves the leading edge of a civilization, and the attitudes of the people present were bound to offer insight into where the country might be heading. Finally, there was the fighting pit itself. While they weren't to his tastes, organized combat arenas were formal martial institutions. He would get to observe the local schools of combat, which in turn offered insight into the mindset of their warriors. I'll take a few and investigate the tree, Karawaki said. I have no appreciation for blood sports. Everyone else wanted to stick to the main group, so they went and looked for a decent place in the stands. The entire structure was carved out of the colossal tree, including much of the seating. Several distinct divisions were made around the arena. There were the balconies reserved for the elite, elevated seating for the regular folk, and sections full of rowdies at the front. We'll be sitting over there, Soraka pointed at an empty stretch of raised seating, though it'll just be easier to use message if you have something important to tell me. Roughly half of the entourage went with Karawaki, most of the glade stalkers, druids and priests who were more interested in the tree than in the fighting. Soraka laid a cloth over his bench before seating himself. Davy and Mitra settled down beside him. Let's not draw attention to ourselves, Jaraka muttered, says the dandy with a flower on each arm. Jaraka insists that you should put bags over your heads, Soraka told his wives. I didn't say that. The Inquisitor, of course, had a valid point. Davy and Mitra drew many gazes, as did he, for that matter. Some things were not so easy to hide, even when wearing non-detection items. He looked over his shoulder to find a young bar sitting alone, staring at Mitra. Too late, the youth turned his gaze away. "Who's fighting today?" Soraka asked. I don't know any of the openers," the youth answered, "but I'm here to see Rolo the Red." "Do you think they'll save Rolo for last?" "Nah, she's not that good yet. A few more wins, maybe. The gap between Jaknar and the rest is pretty big, but I can sort out the pack that's chasing him." Soraka turned back around, continuing his observations of the crowd. Arenas everywhere ordered their fights the same way, which Davy would call good business sense. People came to see their favorites and the high-profile fights, so the organizers saved them for last to build up the crowd and maximize secondary sales. Already, he could see hawkers tempting the appetites of the Fighting Pit's audience, waving fans of leaves over their grills to spread the aroma of cooked meat. Groups of gamblers surrounded the bookmakers, or whatever they called them here since they didn't have books, who were spaced regularly around the spectator seating. "I don't see any performers," Mitra said. "This city might be more boring than I thought." "Now that you mention it, we've barely seen any so far." It was an odd thing in itself. Usually, every tribe had a lawmaster among its elders, who was usually a bard. This in turn led to younger lawmasters being raised for the next generation. Bards were not supposed to be a rare vocation. The fact that they were scarce in Rolengork made Mitra's job harder than usual. "Maybe the bardic arts evolved in a weird way here," Soraka offered. "After all that I've seen," Mitra replied, "I can only think of one way it might have." "Oh? What way might that be?" Exclusive to the patronage of the elite, the Sharon's voice was laced with displeasure. "They know that bards exist, but the only ones we've seen so far are the criers working for Ranadratha, who is probably being supported by all of the clans who want to clear out their excess population. So from tribal elder to court minstrel, or at least some sort of official. I could see how that might happen, especially if it's a politically influential position. I suppose you haven't tried performing in public." "Well, if no one's singing, dancing, or reciting epics and poetry, there's probably a good reason why. Some types of trouble are more annoying than others." At precisely noon, the din of the crowd lowered as a Sing in a leather uniform walked out onto the sand of the arena. He raised his arms wide and his voice roared out over the surrounding stands. "Are you ready for blood?" A deafening response filled the air as the spectators leapt to their feet. Though the announcer may have been a bard, the crowd needed no encouragement to reach a state of frenzied excitement. "You all know the rules," the announcer continued. "These are contests of raw power and personal prowess. No magic. No equipment. Submission holds are permitted, but killing bites will result in instant disqualification." "Magic isn't raw power or personal prowess," Jiraka grumbled. "They do treat their mystics as support," Soraka said. "I thought it was to preserve precious magic casters, but I guess there's more to it. It also means they may not have any paladins, blackguards, eldritch knights, inquisitors, ninjas, exorcists or anything else like that. After all we've seen, did you expect anything of the sort?" "Well, no," the Inquisitor replied, "but crazy new things could have popped up. It's part of why we're here, yeah?" Soraka conceded Jiraka's point with a nod. The people here weren't prejudiced against magic to the point where they went on witch hunts and conducted mass purges, but neither did they seem to use it for anything other than traditional tribal roles. Those who waged war were warriors, everyone else was an auxiliary at best. In urban centers, mystics provided a decentralized sort of private healthcare. The fighting pit looked exactly as it was, a pit filled with sand, so the spectators were offered a clear view from all angles. Soraka crossed his arms and furrowed his brow as the first two duelists emerged. "Is it fair to have mixed race matches this early? That Osalo is at best 2/3 the weight of that bar." "We haven't seen the Osalo fight," Jiraka said. "Maybe they've got something that makes things even." Cheers rose as the 300-kilogram bar exploded across the arena and bowled into the 200-kilogram Osalo. The Osalo didn't get up. "Well, it was close until the fight started." Jiraka sat back down amidst the rising cheers. "Who the hell set up these matches?" "You're from one of the warrior clans?" the youth asked from behind them. "They always say the same thing for these opening fights." "We're warriors, yes," Soraka replied. "And it should be known to anyone that runs a fighting pit. Size and weight mean much at this level of combat. Even you could have trampled that poor Osalo the same way." You think so? But I'm not of the warrior clans." I'm just a fisher's son. When a 300-kilogram anything runs into an Osalo like that, Soraka told him, they're not getting up. A warrior is not born stronger than anyone else of the same race, they must train to realize their potential. Those who are disadvantaged must make up for it in some way. He looked over his shoulder at the youth, who was still focused on the predictably brief starters. The boy was probably still too young to have settled on any profession. You've never aspired to fight here? Soraka asked. Me? The boy sent a nervous glance at him. I told you, I'm a fisher's son. That may be true, he offered the youth a disarming grin, but even fisher's sons sometimes dream of becoming mighty hunters, yes? No, the youth answered quickly. I mean, does that mean you're interested in taking me into your tribe? Congratulations, you three, Jiraka snorted, it's a boy. Soraka jabbed at Jiraka blindly with an elbow. That's not what I meant. New tribes are forming for Anadratha's great venture in the west, no? It's a rare opportunity for those who feel that they can be more than what they are to make the attempt. I don't think it's worth it. His tail lifted curiously at the unexpected answer. Really, now, Soraka said. What makes you say that? They're new lands and all, but city people like me know that you don't need land to survive. I'd rather stay in Kostorafikaral. It's the center of everything. Going west means going to some treeless human land. That's more of a Sing thing, yeah? Well, I doubt it doesn't have any trees. Does that mean you're going to the Draconic Kingdom? The youth asked. I'd like to see what it's like out there, Soraka admitted, but I can't settle. I have a home in the southeast and duties to fulfill. Jiraka yawned as they slogged through dozens of starter matches. The fights could be divided into 3 categories. There were those like the first, where the one with the obvious advantage ended things quickly. Another was where 2 combatants in the same weight class tried to pin one another, much like hunters grappling and pinning their prey. The final category was when smaller, faster beastmen tried to outmaneuver and pounce on their opponent, but it was difficult to perform an ambush when there were no obstructions to speak of. How come they don't change the terrain? Soraka asked, adding obstacles and the like. This field is simply too advantageous for Ba and Sing. The other races complain about that a lot, the youth said, but they've always run the fighting pits this way. Once in a while, there are Con and Osalo victors, so anyone can win. That logic seemed ridiculous to him, but he supposed that those without power could only accept what happened. The rational explanation was that the Con and Osalo who won had trained and grown strong enough to contend before entering the fighting pits. Still, it meant that they would have the opportunity to assess the previously unknown races in Rolengork, so it served their purposes just as well. The first match of note was between a Sing and a Con. Con were even smaller than Osalo, so it appeared to be a gross mismatch from the outset. Since Rana Puya's warriors had shown a considerable degree of prowess, however, he patiently waited for the outcome. At the starting signal, the Sing warrior sprinted forward, his black mane flowing with the speed of his charge. To Soraka's surprise, the Con sprinted away. He leaned forward in his seat as the Sing quickly ran out of stamina, but the Con appeared unwinded. Cheers of encouragement for the Con warrior rose from around the fighting pit, except not from the Ba and Sing spectators, who instead jeered at him for his cowardice. I hated when they do that, the youth behind him growled. They should fight properly. Is that so? Soraka replied, and what is a proper fight? Like the battles between us Ba. They don't run like cowards. Ranasaj had prudently withdrawn to his side of the Yorgulan frontier, but Soraka supposed that the boy didn't know that. He wondered if it was simply the impetuousness of youth or a common belief. There was clearly a divide between the warrior caste and the civilian ones, possibly leading to all sorts of fanciful thinking. Many of the spectators are applauding his move, Soraka noted. A warrior is not obliged to fight at a disadvantage. Expecting an opponent to act like a fool is foolish in itself. The boy didn't seem to have an answer for that, and they turned their attention back to the match. Predictably, the Con's tactic was to tire the Sing out. This brought to light the fact that the Con had a remarkable amount of endurance compared to their village counterparts. It was something they hadn't noticed, as they marched with the Ba clan Kira, and Rana Puya's maneuvers were holding actions conducted jointly with them. In the Beastman Confederacy, every race tended to excel in the niches where their racial advantages gave them an edge. It was something he should have looked out for in Rolengork, but the races were identical or similar enough to those in the Beastman Confederacy, and he had taken things for granted. The problem was how he would be able to figure it out without looking out of place. "Ah, he finally unstupided himself," Jericho said. The exhausted Sing contestant stopped trying to chase the con, resting on his haunches to watch the smaller Field Beastman warily. Soraka wondered how long the fighting pits had been running for. Standardized tactics weren't something that took a very long time to establish, especially when there were real stakes involved. Maybe the contestants weren't formally trained at all. Everyone leaned forward as the con warrior tested the Sing's defenses. The only offensive option available for the con was to either use ranged martial arts or hope that his opponent's exhaustion would sufficiently slow his reactions. He chose the latter, but the reaction of the crowd indicated that the former probably wasn't an option in the first place. An exchange of slashing claws drew cheers from both sides as the con danced to avoid being grappled by his foe. Most of the cheers turned into groans as it proved too difficult against the Sing's longer reach. In a heartbeat, the larger contestant's claws latched onto the con's hide and he was quickly pinned. There was no escape after that. Another degree higher, maybe. So far, the fundamental gap between the races remained. No martial arts had been employed, and the techniques demonstrated were still within the realm of mundane combat. "I wonder if there's some logic to the matchmaking here," Soraka said. "People must get bored of this kind of fight." "Is that so?" Soraka looked over his shoulder at the youth. Maybe he should have invited him to sit in the same row. "Do you find this entertaining?" Soraka asked. "Wouldn't, say, matches between those of the same race be more technically satisfying?" "The Osalo and Con want that," the youth answered, "but there are far more Bar and Sing fighters than the rest. Besides, power is what makes a warrior, right? Everyone respects power." "You'd still get that in matches between the Bar and Sing," Soraka said. "But wouldn't it be more interesting to sort out who the best fighter of each race is, and then pit the best of each race against one another? At these low brackets, the Con and Osalo are just getting clobbered most of the time because of natural differences and how they're being forced to fight." "I wouldn't know anything about that." The non-committal response gave Soraka pause. There was no way someone who frequented arenas would be ignorant of combat basics. "Hey Mitra, what do you think of that?" "I think we know who truly rules Roland Gork." There was no sense of racial hierarchy between Rana Saj, Rana Poya and Rana Ori. "Probably because there's space, yeah? Those clans have their own territories. Everyone's mixed together in the cities, competing for resources." Soraka sighed, remaining silent as he watched the matches of the lower brackets play out. Roland Gork was strict in certain ways, but did not make any of the considerations a more advanced society would. Beyond the divisions of clan and caste, it was most likely might makes right, as Mitra had stated not long after their arrival. Yet, at the same time, there was little sign of activism on the part of the smaller races. The disparity was a source of pressure that would have likely fragmented the primitive confederation had they no outlets for their burgeoning populations. "Oh, this one looks better." They finally advanced to a higher bracket, and Soraka immediately sensed the difference in the contestants. "Do you know who that Osalo is?" he asked the youth. "That's Shork, I think. One of those warriors who started off strong." "Started off? Do you mean to say that she's not doing so well anymore?" "Yeah. She's been stuck in this bracket for months. Probably as far as her preparations could take her. One could only get so far with informal training." He wasn't sure how many brackets there were, but the youth made it sound like she had a ways to go. Still, the Osalo in the crowd were not lacking in their support. Shork's opponent was a hulking Bar female with the look of someone who had focused on physical conditioning. At a glance, he could tell that she had focused her training on the natural pounds and pin hunting tactics of the race. She's all muscles." Davy wrinkled her nose. "What self-indulgent male fantasy did she pop out of?" "Hey," Soraka said, "don't mock the earnest efforts of others." Of course you'd leap to her defense. "You'd better bulk up, Mitra. His eye's going to wander off to some savage huntress at this rate." "No thanks." The starting signal sounded. Unsurprisingly, the Bar warrior exploded towards her opponent. Surprisingly, the Osalo did as well. An exchange of claws flashed in the afternoon sun. Shork's attack landed first, then her figure blurred to the side. The Osalo warrior emerged from the trade unscathed, leaving a long set of furrows on her opponent's right forearm. Ho! Soraka leaned forward. An evasion combo, huh? You know what that was? The youth asked. A martial art, Soraka answered. It allows her to dodge much faster than she would normally. What? But that's cheating. Magic isn't allowed. Martial arts aren't magic, kid, Jaraka said. Well, I guess some people call martial arts a warrior's magic, but it's the result of martial discipline and skill. Only warriors can use them. I bet if Muscles over there hammered Shulk into the ground with a strike art, he'd be perfectly fine with it. 3 more exchanges occurred, to much the same result. Blood matted the bar warrior's coat, but she looked more furious than anything else. Cries of encouragement rose to support the wounded contestant, or rather cries to crush her skull, tear her apart and rip out her spine. I thought killing wasn't allowed here, Soraka muttered. This is bad, Mitra said. I don't think she's going to hold back. Shulk appeared all too aware of the oppressive atmosphere. She circled her seething opponent twice before slowly loping in to strike. The bar pounced with a savage roar before the Osalo closed the distance, and Shulk dodged to the side. A brief chase ensued, with the bar snarling wordlessly all the way. Once the bar tired itself out, Shulk took a long look at her opponent. After a moment, she relaxed and raised her arms. I concede, she said. The crowd exploded into a mix of cheers and groans. Many shook their heads in resignation. Soraka rose from his bench. He didn't turn to look at the youth, fearing what sort of reaction he might see. Let's go and speak to that Osalo, he said. His entourage rose at his words and they filed out of the stands. They would be able to spectate more fights over their stay, but he wasn't sure whether they would be able to track down Shulk in the chaotic metropolis if they didn't see her right away. As Soraka made his way down to the fighting pit's preparation rooms, heated voices echoed up the stairs. Why did you quit? A male voice asked. What sort of question is that? Shulk's voice answered, did you look at that brute? She wanted to end me. You can't keep doing this. The other fighters are starting to use it against you just because they know you'll back down. Soraka could almost sense the sheer frustration filling the air. He turned the corner to find Shulk and another Osalo, who was watching the female gather her things into a small leather satchel. Shulk glanced in Soraka's direction, then rose to her full height. Who are you? She flicked her ear in annoyance. My name is Soraka. I saw your fight and came down to speak to you. I don't need yet another bar telling me that I made a wise decision. I wasn't aware that happened. It was a prudent decision, though. Everyone else here just seems to stubbornly take their beatings even when the result should be obvious. Shulk picked up her satchel and threw it over her shoulder. She walked past Soraka without a word, leaving the male standing alone in the preparation room. I should have probably let Mitra handle her. The Osalo contestant evidently had an issue with Bar. It probably wasn't enough to be candid. He turned to gesture for his Gladestalkers to follow her, but then realized they were all with Karawaki. Why are you following me? I said I came down to speak with you, didn't I? Don't tell me you're one of those perverts who are into other races. If you are, I'm not for sale. Hey Mitra, help me out here. But I like watching you flail around helplessly. What did I do to deserve this? I wonder. This is our first time in the big city, Mitra told Shulk, so we're unaware of any of the problems you may be experiencing. My husband is entirely earnest, he would just like to have a word with you. Fine, Shulk said. Say what you want to say. It's not that I wanted to say anything in particular. Shulk started walking away again. Mitra chuffed in amusement. What I meant to say, Soraka walked after her, was that I'd like to understand what's going on in the city. Between the people, I mean. I'd rather not get tripped up by any of its intricacies. A bar won't be tripping on any of Kostarafikeral's intricacies, the Osalo scoffed. Not unless you cross one of the big clans. Has it ever crossed your mind that your conduct could be considered offensive? Soraka asked. I can take care of myself. They walked out onto one of the massive routes leading out of the fighting pit. Shulk immediately leapt down off of it, landing lightly on her feet 20 meters below. Well, I guess the bar and sing around here wouldn't be able to chase her if she can do that. He picked up his pace, catching up with Shulk a few minutes later. Our husband is a stalker, Mitra sobbed. He doesn't even care that he's doing it in front of his wives. Maybe his wives should do something about that, Shulk said. Like feeding him to the lake god. There's a lake god? Shulk turned around with a furrow on her brow. You're really not from around here, are you? You don't even have the same feeling as the other bar. I thought I said we're not from around here, Soraka replied. Will you speak with me now? I can make it worth your time. The only thing worth my time right now is figuring out how to beat brutes like that Rollo the Red just now. That was Rollo the Red? The way the boy behind me went on about her, I thought she'd be more impressive. How was she not impressive? She could break me in half. With the style of fighting you chose, I figured you'd have a different opinion. But if learning how to beat larger warriors in a fighting pit is all that you want, I'd consider it more than a fair exchange for your cooperation. Why are you still following me? I'm not going to run away. We're not following you, Soraka replied. We just happen to be going the same way. Most Felid beastmen were naturally skittish, and it appeared that Osalo were no exception. Being stalked, startled, stared at or stopped unexpectedly naturally led to dramatic or at least wary reactions. As a contestant in a bloodsport with thousands of spectators, however, Soraka thought that Shulk should have at least overcome a good part of it. Well, Soraka said, since we seem to be stuck together, from whom did you learn how to fight? I just watched other people, Shulk replied. It's not hard. I would say grasping martial arts by just watching other people is fairly significant. With the city as large as it is, I figured there would be some sort of combat school or at least a system of apprenticeship for every vocation. Their path took them to the confluence of the two rivers from before. Shulk turned west to follow the larger river upstream. I have no idea what you're talking about, she said. Can you read? No. Do you know what language you're speaking right now? Huh? Soraka exchanged looks with Davy and Mitra. The way that the world facilitated communication between its inhabitants led to some quirks in linguistic development. Like Shulk, many believed that everyone simply spoke the same language. This was especially true in places where literacy was poor and society was dominated by a single race or culture. It didn't take much exposure to the outside world to realize that it wasn't the case, but most people in such circumstances never had the opportunity to experience the world beyond their homes. The people of Roengork employed a bastardization of multiple languages, which had developed to the point where it had become its own language. Depending on the society, such languages were usually called common, as it was what could be commonly used by all members of a multiracial civilization. Other, similar, systems included thieves' cant and merchant lingo, both of which had a linguistic gradient that shifted from region to region. Do you speak a different way at home? Mitra asked, or with other Osalo? No, Shulk flicked her right ear. What are you trying to get at? Why does it matter? It probably doesn't matter to most, Soraka said, but knowing how culture and language develop can be instrumental in understanding others. Oh yeah? Then what language are you speaking? It's called Prustenai. And what's so great about it? Soraka let out a laugh at her pointed questioning. Only certain races can employ its full vocabulary, Soraka told her. Others are physically incapable. Before I came here, I only knew of two races that could, the Bar and the Entulu of the Far East. The Far East, so the Commonwealth? No, they're a bit further east than that. The Entulu dwelled in the northern rainforests of eastern Arborea, which were twice as far from the Beastman Confederacy as Roengork was. They were on the other side of three of the Central Powers, which made it difficult for the Confederacy to establish trade and lines of communication with them. Anyway, Soraka told her, the fact that the Osalo can speak Prustenai makes it a surprise that there appears to be tension with the Bar here in the city. Similarities between races are usually a bridge that facilitates mutual understanding. Or mutual hatred, Jirika added. Oh, we understand each other, all right, Shulk said sourly. They get what they want, and the rest of us get the scraps. But why? Why? Shulk stopped and turned to give him an annoyed look. After a moment, the look vanished and she led them to a path above one of the wharves along the river. Watch, she said. Soraka leaned slightly to look between the trees. Below them, dozens of citizens were conducting their business on the wooden boardwalk. Most of them appeared to be waiting for the morning catch from the lake to be delivered to the shore. They shifted forward as an Osalo fisherman carried one of his baskets up the pier. In short order, the bar ended up at the front of the crowd, followed by the Sing. There was no malice or fuss, it simply happened. I see, Soraka said. Do you behave the same way? Of course I do, Shulk sighed. I don't like it, but I can't help it. If something bigger came along, smaller things got out of the way. Triply so if that bigger thing was a predator, as letting one get too close meant that one might end up as a meal. It was pure instinct translating directly into the behavior displayed before them. The Bar and Sing don't do anything on their part to prevent this. Why would they? Because you're all members of the same confederation? You're not wild animals loitering around a kill waiting for your turn. The lack of racial segregation in Rolengork was laudable, but they did nothing to actively address the issues that came with having multiple races in a single society. It may have been especially difficult to recognize them, especially since everyone was either a Felid or canine beastman. Does something happen if you try to stand your ground? Soraka asked. It's dozens of those Bar we're talking about here, they don't even have to go out of their way to do it. We just get muscled out while they're focused on what they're trying to do. But someone must say something, Soraka said. If this happens everywhere in the city, it's a big hit to quality of life. What's that? What's what? The last part of what you said. In this case, quality of life refers to your ability to conduct your affairs without things like this interfering in them. If what we see here is representative of what happens all over the city, then Osalo and Kon are essentially last in line for everything between Felid beastmen. Line, like those things the warrior clans make? Out of the corner of his eye, Soraka saw Jirika cover his face in his paw. Might makes right, indeed. Precedence was determined by size and strength. It did not only apply to warfare, but also everyday life. Everyone in Rolengork saw what was going on as natural, so those who were treated poorly could only be annoyed. The problem was that natural behavior only got one so far, and a society driven by natural behavior usually ended up collapsing under its own weight. At what point that collapse occurred depended on the strength of the races involved and what that natural behavior was. Powerful races like dragons could follow their natural behaviors almost indefinitely, while weak races like humans couldn't get far at all. They continued on their way up the river, leaping across its 6-meter span to walk on the other side. What about official business? Soraka asked. Does this ignorance of their own behavior affect that, too? How would I know? I don't do any official business. But you are affected by what those in charge decide, yes? Are there preferential laws passed or unfair rulings made by city officials? Not in that way, no. But that just makes it worse. To the people above, it makes it look as if everything they do is fair. That's the excuse they make if someone complains about something. The rules don't favor anyone, but all the little things that make up most of life aren't covered by their big rules. Soraka nodded thoughtfully. That part, at least, was not unique to primitive societies. Legislation was enacted to enforce the policies of a nation, but their scope was very broad. Countries usually had multiple levels of government that worked to ensure that things operated smoothly. Rolengork had a presiding council, which its member clans answered to. Tribal chieftains answered to their clan lords. The cities, however, did not appear to have that same organization. Furthermore, while the other cities were ruled by single clans and the vast majority of their citizens tended to be of that clan's race, Khorstorofi Keral was a mix of everything. Oh, Miss Davy, you're back. And with Shulk. You know her? Yes, Itzli bobbed his head. Shulk is my daughter, but I didn't know you were going to the docks. Soraka felt Shulk shift back slightly at her father's words. We didn't go to the docks, Davy said. We ran across Shulk while we were doing our own thing. She didn't like the idea of 24 Bar walking behind her, so we struck up a conversation on our way back. Is that so? The innkeeper's tail curled curiously. What about you, Shulk? Were you able to find any work? The Bar and Sing took all the jobs, Shulk said. Shulk's father sighed. I told you it wouldn't work, he said. They'll snatch up everyone big and strong looking for manual labor first. It's better to stick to Osalo jobs, like clearing out monkeys from the canopy. Everyone is doing that, Shulk complained. Or pick fruit for the herds. They're doing that, too. There are 10,000 Osalo chasing monkeys and picking fruit overhead. I can't make a living like that. We can hire Shawk as a guide during our stay, Davy offered. If she would like to, of course. It's convenient for us since she's staying in the same place. Would you be so generous? Lee brightened. It's getting harder and harder to find work these days. They swapped out a few members of the guard watching their belongings, as well as sending a fresh shift to relieve the one at the docks watching over their barges. Shawk returned in a fresh change of clothes, and they left before her father could start chatting them up again. Thanks for not telling, Shawk said after they were a safe distance away. Does your father have something against you competing in the fighting pits? He wants me to take over the inn, eventually, she said. But it's usually not busy enough to need the entire family working there. And out of all of the avenues you could have chosen, it was the fighting pits. It seems something more suited to the warrior caste. We are warrior caste. Shawk turned around. The Kuroko's cliffs is our hold. My ancestors converted it into an inn when the city started pushing into our territory. That's quite the career change. Are all innkeepers here part of the warrior caste? No, most of them are just from regular tribes that made their homes in the area. It's pointless trying to rule in a city where no one recognizes your authority. The most annoying part is that the outsider clans have all the clout in our old territory because they got to keep theirs. Since Shawk's tribe or clan or whatever it was resided right in the center of Rolengork, there wasn't even anywhere to migrate to. They were just a bit of forgotten collateral damage. How much territory does your clan still control? Davy asked. Just the area around the hold, Shawk answered. Most of the Osalo families within 2 kilometers or so are part of our clan, but those old ties are mostly gone now. Everyone just does what they can to survive in the city. So you don't have any influence left at all? Not like the real lords, no. A broken line. Being a lord was not simply a matter of being the most powerful individual around. As with commanders, authority needed to be established and bonds forged with one's subordinates. Without them, a lord was simply an exceptional specimen of their race. Soraka's gaze traveled down the Osalo's coat of spotted rosettes. Neither she nor her father exhibited the traits of a lord, but Shawk's blood still called for her to take action. She was driven to compete and stand above, and she innately recognized the societal issues plaguing her people. So if you learn how to win against your opponents reliably, Soraka asked, what will you do? I haven't thought that far yet, Shawk answered. The prizes are good, so maybe I can fix things up a bit around our home. Gei. We can't help her too much. But we can still help. This is too sad. If you don't do something, I will. Soraka tried to imagine the unspeakable chaos that would erupt from Mitra's intervention. He hoped what he could devise was sufficient for his wife's whimsical tastes. Soraka. He nearly tripped as his second wife's voice rang in his head. Whoops. Hi. Don't hi me. Where in the world are you? We went back to the inn. The inn? Do you know how many circles I made around the fighting pit looking for you? You do have all of our trackers, you know. Anyway, we found an interesting local who is willing to show us around. Come and catch up with us. Soraka turned his attention back to Shawk, who was looking at him curiously. Is there a poorer part of your territory you can show us? Soraka asked, something like the Paupers district near the lakefront. There is, Shawk answered, but why do you want to go there? It's not exactly nice to look at. We saw something that might be the work of druids on the way from the docks. I thought there might be a similar site around here. Druids? Mystics? Mystics, huh? Maybe you mean that. They followed the river as it bent around the Kuroko's cliffs. 500 meters upstream, they saw something shocking. Well, shocking for Rolengork. So they don't build bridges, but they can build dams? It wasn't a magnificent dam by any stretch of the imagination, but the fact that there was one at all here was unprecedented. How did you build this? Soraka asked. According to my parents, it was there for as long as anyone can remember. Well, it was broken before, but some debris washed downstream and blocked it up. He could see where the repairs which consisted of a haphazard mess of wood and clay, had been affected. The dam was originally fashioned out of seamless basalt, suggesting that it had been magically shaped. It was only 4 meters high, but that was more than enough to create an expansive lake in the relatively flat valley bottom. Jiraiya went up to perform a closer inspection. The Inquisitor walked the entire span, jumping back and forth over the damaged sections. He stopped at a patch of dirt overgrown by flowering shrubs. There was probably a workshop or some sort of power transfer station right here, he said. You can still see the spillway on the opposite side. Those broken sections are where the conduits that fed water into the turbines were. This entire side of the dam was probably 3 or 4 meters lower than it is now, so it's all buried or maybe broken and washed away from whatever wrecked it. Was it enchanted? Soraka asked. Can't tell. Broke shit is broke. Shulk looked back and forth between them, looking like she was trying to understand arcane incantations. What are you two talking about? There are so many words in there that I don't understand. Just talking about what this is, Jiraiya replied. We see this sort of situation a lot. People get blasted back to nothing and sit on artifacts of the previous era without ever knowing what they do. You mean this is from our country before the demon gods? Well, you did say it's been here for as long as anyone can remember. The young Osalo female walked over and placed a paw against the moss-covered stone of the old dam. What can we do with it? If you fix it up, Jiraiya said. A lot. But, this take a lot to fix up. Well, I guess you don't even need to fix it up good as new, you just need to make something that works with what you have. Are there any other places like this? Soraka asked. There used to be, Shulk answered. In every valley between the hills here. They were all along each river feeding into the lake. What happened to them? They were torn down. The flooding they could cause threatened the residential areas along the rivers. So why is this one still here? Spite. Huh? Shulk stepped away from the dam, planting her paws on her hips as she stared across its length. My clan's territory used to be a lot bigger. One of the clan heads got so mad about our shrinking holdings he decided that if they couldn't keep it, they'd flood it so no one else could have it. Then they fought off everyone that tried to destroy the dam. So why is it still standing? You have a lot more people to fight off now. People started using the lake it made, Shulk shrugged. So now they don't want to empty it out. Ridiculous. It made a sort of sense, but it was a stupid sort of sense. Stubborn people creating other stubborn people, using the vestiges of a lost technology that they had no clue about. Oh, a dam, Karuvaki's voice came from behind them. Shulk started and spun around. Who? This is one of my wives, Karuvaki, Soraka said. She was the one that pointed out the mystic thing in the slums. Karuvaki, this is Shulk. She was a contestant at that fighting pit we came from and also happens to be Itsley's daughter. This entire area is their ancestral land. The young Osalo peered at Karuvaki, then Soraka. I knew it, she said. You are one of those. One of what? A pervert. I've never seen anything like her before, but she's not Bar. She's Lega, Soraka told her. A cross between a Bar and Sing. Shulk backed away, her amber eyes narrowed in disgust. I know they're sort of rare, Soraka said, but do you mean to say that there aren't any here? Of course not, Shulk said. Bar and Sing are different races. Why would I'm not marrying you, just so you know. Not that you come remotely close to qualifying, Karuvaki muttered. Anyway, what's going on with this dam here? A relic from before the demon gods, Soraka said. It looks like it was constructed with magic, but we've no idea whether it was enchanted. If it was, Karuvaki said, that would imply something very strong breaking it down. Given that the demon gods had felled a colossal tree, stone enchanted beyond the strength of adamantite was well within the realm of their power. They proceeded past the dam, finding a lake withered by the dry season on the other side. Where the jungle floor was exposed, the residents had moved down from their branches to set up crude workshops between the trees. Many of the trees had permanent dwellings built in the largest branches of the canopy layer. The Osalo seemed equally at ease moving from tree to tree as they were moving along the ground. I guess this is Osalo exclusive land, Soraka said. That's right, Shulk replied. The other races aren't comfortable living like this. They can't get around very well, either. They're more like the Entulu than they are like the Tendua. While Tendua could climb trees with some proficiency, they weren't a semi-arboreal race like the Entulu. He wondered what else the Osalo were capable of. So where do these mystics work if the place is flooded half of the year? They work pretty much everywhere, but I think I know what you're talking about. This way. From what I've seen so far, Karavaki said as they followed Shork, they have an elegant system in place here. How so? Soraka asked. Well, the smells of habitation aren't very strong here, for one. It was overpowering down at the docks. The seasonal flooding washes everything away. Rains during the dry season help, too. Do your people fish these waters, Shork? Only fishers are allowed to fish, Shork replied. And they observe strict limits set by the mystics. It's not enough to feed everyone, so we have to do other things. They passed a herd of nug foraging under the watchful eye of Osalo ranchers. The one-ton animals were consuming the dried mud as much as they were grazing on plants. I take it that your ranchers here don't purchase as much salt as those in other parts of the city do, Karavaki said. How do you know that? Shork looked over her shoulder. How do you know anything of what we're doing? You're not even from around here. We may not be locals, but we know how things work. Your nug are consuming the clay here because the floodwaters deposit salt and other minerals that they need to stay healthy. That saves you on purchases of salt imported from the Great Loot. I didn't know that. Well, that's good. Salt is expensive and we can't really afford it. You don't have alluvial mining operations here? Karavaki asked. What's that? Searching for gems and precious metals deposited in the sediment and riverbanks. I believe they comprise the majority of your country's exports in terms of trade value. A bit. We don't get much. Most of the good spots belong to the tribes outside of the city. Here's the thing that you were probably asking about, by the way. They arrived at the base of the same hill that Kuroko's cliffs was a part of. This part of it was north-facing and the understory was permanently shrouded in shadow. Was this it, Karavaki? Soraka asked. I think so, yes. The sacred claw went ahead with the group's divine casters. The local druids have harnessed a nutrient cycle here. Is this technique being spread across the city? We actually copied some mystics in another part of the city, Shork said. It looked like a good idea, and it seems to work even better for us than it does for them. Jungles were extremely efficient when it came to their nutrient cycles, to the point that their soil quality became poor. All sorts of things, even whole corpses, could be stripped down and processed by the native organisms within a day or two. Soraka leaned close to one of the huge, branched fungi attached to the stones, trying to figure out what was going on. Is there something I can help you with? Oh, is that you, Shork? An aged Osalo called out as he doddered over from where he was tending to the fungus garden. He was clad in the same simple garb as the other citizens, save for the glazed beads and colorful feathers that marked him as a mystic. Two young Osalo followed in his footsteps. Elder Potley, Shork bobbed her head in greeting. These are some guests staying at my father's inn. They wanted to take a look around. Is that so? My name is Karavaki, his wife gestured to the other divine casters in the entourage. It's our first time in Khostorfi Kerala and we couldn't help but notice similar work being done in other parts of the city. We're quite impressed by what's going on here. I see, the elder nodded. It's nearly unheard of for clan mystics to leave their clans, so you're most welcome to take a look around. If that's the case, Karavaki said, who has been spreading this technique around? Most of Khostorfi Kerala's resident mystics aren't affiliated with any clan, Elder Potley said. We simply tend to the communities around us. People simply imitate what they think is useful from what they see nearby. It did make for a good way for knowledge to spread. The relatively porous social and economic boundaries in cities were often fertile ground for new ideas. This was especially pronounced in places like Rolengork, where the clans tended to keep to themselves. Does that mean that this hasn't spread to the clans outside of the city? Karavaki asked. I can't know for sure, the elder answered, but most likely not. The people of the city tend to be looked down upon by the powerful and wealthy clans. Well, maybe looked down upon is the wrong way to put it. We are simply unassociated and outside of their awareness. Since you seem to be unaware of this, I take it that you're not from around here. We're travelers from the Beastman Confederacy, Karavaki replied. What's that? Shork asked. Elder Potley furrowed his brow at the young Osalo. You'll have to forgive Shork for her ignorance, he lowered his head. Our youths are so busy scratching out a living in the cities that most know nothing of the world beyond. Our elders are so busy bemoaning the ignorance of their youths that I still don't know what the Beastman Confederacy is, Shulk grumbled. It's one of the great powers of the world, girl, Elder Potley said, then turned back to Kawabaki. That such a esteemed company would find something of interest in our humble city is an honor. One can never know everything, Elder Potley, Kawabaki replied. We've seen systems similar to this, but the species involved here are unfamiliar. If you don't mind, could you explain the entire process as you understand it? Of course. I would be delighted if our efforts spread beyond our little city gardens. The elder brought them deeper into the shadowed grove, which was large enough to be considered a farm, and stopped at a section where the fungi had been stripped off of the trees and cliff face. As you may have noticed, Elder Potley said, Rolengork is already beyond the limit of how many beastmen it can support. While the warrior clans turn to expansion as a solution, or at least as a way to expend our excess population, a few of us are working to increase the efficiency of our domestic industries. The elder walked over to the nearest tree with the look of one satisfied by their work. Outside of the city, Nug ranchers have the luxury of relying on the natural processes of our native jungle to sustain their herds. In the city, however, the population density is too great for nature to support. Still, nature offers us a reprieve. Elder Potley tapped the tree lightly with a claw. Its bark seemed to come alive with countless white hairs. Mitra's claws dug painfully into Soraka's arm. This is a species of worm that we discovered in the city a few years ago. We're not sure where it came from, maybe it has always been here, only that it goes through its food very quickly. Does it present any dangers? Kawabaki asked. Not that we've seen. If it did attack beastmen, we'd have people disintegrating in their litters overnight. As far as we know, it simply decomposes waste like so many other jungle species of this type. It just does it at an extraordinarily rapid pace. Kawabaki looked over at the druids in the entourage, who nodded in response. They certainly merit in-depth study, she said. So I assume that their byproducts go into growing all the fungus that we walked by. Yes, that's right. Elder Potley went over to another tree where thousands of branching fungi were sprouting. All of the trees, plus the cliff over there, are seeded with the spores of these blood antlers. Despite the fearsome name, they're a favorite of many herbivores in our jungle. It's a simple technique, really. We feed our refuse to the worms and the castings of the worms nurture the blood antlers. The blood antlers feed our nug. How long do they take to mature? 3 or 4 days as long as we keep conditions ideal. I don't mean to brag, but it's an ideal crop for a Salo to cultivate. He led them over to an even darker part of the jungle, gesturing to the canopy above. This is our current project. As we Osalo can dwell in trees, we're turning the canopy into our city. By doing so, we can trap moisture in the understory and can turn the entire area akin to a cave where we can grow fungi all the way to the ceiling. We're also thinking of bringing in wildfowl to help with pest control and provide more food, but we're still deliberating over candidates. I would dare say that this is the most impressive thing I've seen in Rolengork so far, Kawabaki said. Are there projects like this going on anywhere else? The fungus gardens that you saw near the docks, but they're much smaller in scale. If they become commonplace, however, we'll be able to support a lot more people. It would also bring a significant economic advantage to those pioneering the industry, but he wasn't sure how much power industrial might add in Rolengork. Still, an innovation of this scale was sure to bring societal change with it. Out of curiosity, Soraka said, was someone responsible for taking initiative with this project? Elder Potley gestured to Shulk. Shulk here was instrumental in convincing the families in the area to cooperate. She also helped to fund our research and provided food and materials for labor and construction. Soraka smiled inwardly as Shulk looked away. Despite all appearances, it seemed that this Osalo clan still had its lord.